Masi oyo ya boye kaina pana mawa na kokate Asusu oyo na ponaka bawela bokonzi pena babwatilio Avoti tango ekomaka kaina komi moto ona bango Nakomituna mondele akende ikanda totsuaka oya nani ye Afrika
Greetings to you all, greetings and welcome to this policy dialogue today, which is a very unusual topic, but very important one. And I want to introduce you to my sister, Justina Mkoko, who run the show, introduce everybody, and introduce our main presenter, Tony Rila. Justina, welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Doc, and good evening to everyone who is joining us for this policy dialogue, the 16th, number 16 this year. And like the Doc has said, we are looking at a very interesting topic. Who guards the guards? I am at this stage going to be introducing Tony Rilla, who is a senior researcher with the Research and Advocacy Unit, to kick us off on this discussion that has caused a lot of discomfort for a lot of citizens, because where we think we are supposed to be getting people who look after us and also look after our property, what we are seeing is the rise in crime committed by those same people. Over to you, Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justina, and good evening, everybody. On behalf of the forum, I think it's very important to discuss this issue. It was prompted by, I think, a general noticing, as Justina's pointed out, that the newspaper reports were filled with reports in which it appeared that members of the security forces were involved in criminal activities, and serious criminal activities. That was reinforced by senior members of the government and even the president talking about their concerns about what was happening. So this particular report is to try to unpack that, and to unpack it in the context of Zimbabwe. And I will share my screen now, if I may, so that you're able to see the points I'm making and follow what I'm saying. Okay. Okay, so who guards the guards? It's an old political question, that those who are in charge of the coercive forces of the state must be under some kind of control. And the subtext is to monitor crime and security force involvement in crime. And as I pointed out, very senior members of the government have expressed concern about this. But we must look at it in a real context. It's not just enough in contemporary Zimbabwe to say soldiers and policemen and others are involved in crime, so what? We've got to look at this in the context of Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe currently is regarded as a fragile state by objective measures, by many observers of the polities around the world. Zimbabwe is regarded as one of the most fragile states in the world by the Fragile States Index. And fragility and its relationship to crime become therefore important to look at. So let's just, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time in this, and the context of this is not to talk endlessly about the current context of Zimbabwe, but it is important to unpack what they mean by fragility, because every time the word fragility is used in failed state, people interchange them. And failed state is not what Zimbabwe is, but it certainly is fragile. So there are some definitions, and there is some consensus, and I've highlighted this in red because there are different senses in which states are fragile. Some states are fragile where national and local authorities are incapable of delivering crucial public goods, such as safety, security, and other basic services. We're not a state where we're having a contest over authority with armed groups and ethnic secession or any of those kinds of non-state actors. That's not Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is not failed, it still has a state, much as we might draw some conclusions as to whether the state is functioning or not. But nonetheless, there is a state, and the state does control coercive power quite clearly. So what are these features of fragility? Now, there are a series of different factors. When you try to decide whether a country is fragile or not, you look at structural and economic factors, you look at political and institutional factors, you look at social factors, and you look at international factors. Now, not all of these apply to Zimbabwe, but some quite clearly do. Poverty, low income, and economic decline. Natural resource wealth, the fights over resources, demographic stress. We have demographic stress. We have one of the very large youth bulges in the world. 70% of our population is under 35. There are political and institutional factors, crises of state legitimacy, authoritarian governance, repression of political competition, succession crises, reform crises, state predation, neo-patrimonial politics. These are factors, again, that are there. And I'm highlighting the ones in red because you can argue that these apply to Zimbabwe currently. There's social factors, social exclusion, gender inequality, lack of social cohesion, including lack of social capital and weak civil society. And finally, international factors, legacy of colonialism, international political economy. That's important. Zimbabwe is a country that is repudiated by many international actors and is the subject of restrictive conditions and some sanctions. And of course, we're a country that is going to be at great risk of climate change. That's just come out in the IPCC. Now, when fragility exists, then something also comes along with it. And this is a very big concern in fragile states, and what people call transnational organized crime, or TOC. So when states become fragile and governance becomes weak, then it creates space for criminal activities. And they talk about transnational because it's not merely local, it begins to move across borders in particular kinds of ways. And this happens in conflict-afflicted states, where there's clearly civil war or major insurgency going on, like in Mozambique at the current time, but it also happens in fragile states. And what they look at is three things that are involved in this transnational organized crime: the sale of illegal goods and services, a certain organized structure with some form of hierarchy, and the perpetuation of their existence through violence or threats of violence, and corrupt relations with public officials. Now here, of course, I would draw your attention to a series of reports that came out recently about cartels. And linked to that organized crime becomes a very serious issue for a country, and that's illicit financial flows. Now, what happens with crime is the money may stay in the country, but it also leaves the country. And that becomes very important. And it is agreed by what's called the East and Southern African Money Laundering Group, a group which Zimbabwe was part of many years ago, has been assessed by the Eastern, this anti-money laundering group. And in the report, which is a joint report done by the group, the experts of the group and the Zimbabwean government, it was agreed that these kinds of activities that are on your screen now, drug trafficking, smuggling of precious minerals, gold, for example, parallel market activities involving foreign currency deals, corruption, in particular practices in the fuel industry, we know about that, misrepresentation of quality and nature of exports, that's been linked to the cigarette trade, and at the bottom, armed robbery and theft of motor vehicles and stolen vehicle registration. It's agreed by the government that these are existing problems and that the government must take measures to deal with that. So this is a frame we wish to look at in the context of crime and the involvement of the security force in crime. Now, just one point that's important about linking transnational organized crime and illicit monetary flows is the sense of transnational organized crime brings up people like the Colombian cartels or the mafia or those sorts of things. But workers in Africa talk about a synergistic relationship that often happens between criminal groups and state agencies, maybe even the government. So there can be this flow backwards and forwards where it's not just the question that the organized criminals capture the state, it's also the fact that the state engages in relationships with organized criminals. And there have been reports about this. There was reports in the Herald about a whole smuggling ring that goes out through the eastern districts into Mozambique, bringing things backwards and forwards with the connivance of state officials, or actually ex-state officials in this case, who would be described as they're no longer serving people. They would be a criminal group, a criminal cartel perhaps. So that becomes very important to think about in this overall context of when you hear that serious crime is rising, what's it all about? Where's it located? What's its context? So with this background in mind, we then decided to go and look at what was going on. And what we did was to then begin to look at the crime statistics. Now, one of the useful things in Zimbabwe is generally we have very good public data. And that very good public data is provided by the Zimbabwe National Statistical Agency, SimStats. And in their quarterly digests, they do report on crime. They get the crime statistics from the Zimbabwean Republic Police and from the courts, and they produce tables to tell you what's going on. So if we look at selected crime statistics, these were taken from the SimStats quarterly digest of statistics in the fourth quarter of 2019. And they summarize in those tables what has been going on for not all crime, and we're not reporting on all crime. We're reporting on a specific range of things that they report on: murder, rape, assault, assault with intent to do grievous harm or aggravated assault, offenses involving firearms, armed robbery, robberies, and all drugs. And they provided data on 2017, 2018, and 2019. Unfortunately, the quarterly digests for 2020 are not available. But what you can see, and particularly if you look at the gross numbers, you can see that there's a pattern. It's not changing very, very dramatically over the years. Okay, about 90,000, 100,000 offenses of all of these are reported. But what you can see in it is a very dramatic increase in 3, possibly 4 sets of statistics. There's a big increase in firearms offenses, and that's not just use of firearms. These are people dealing in guns, selling guns, etc., etc. In armed robberies basically double between 2018 and 2019. And robberies go up by a third at least. And drug offenses have gone up as well. So if you look at the percentages, and the percentages at the bottom are there, are the percentages of those crimes in 2019. And what you can see is assault massively is the massive contributor to all of those crimes. If you add them all together, 73% of those deal with assault. Okay. But you also see that robbery is 12%. That's a fair statistic. It's the next biggest category. And you will see that armed robberies are very, very small percentage in 2019 of the total number of offenses. But you do see that they have increased and they have doubled from 2018 to 2019. But without the 2020 statistics, it's not possible to say, was this trend in increase continuing? Now, one of the things that did happen in 2020 was, of course, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And in many countries, South Africa in particular, they saw a dramatic drop in crime during 2020, mainly because of lockdowns. There was greater policing on the streets, and soldiers too. So these sorts of crimes, very serious crimes, dropped pretty dramatically in South Africa. The anecdotal data reported by the Zimbabwe Republic Police is we had the same phenomena in Zimbabwe. Everything dropped, and that was one of the if you want, the byproducts of this strange life we've been living under COVID, under lockdowns. Now, what we then did was we decided we would try to see what happened in 2021. And the way we did that was to look at exactly those crimes that we reported before: murder, rape, assault, etc., etc., etc. And the way we did that was we looked at the public domain information, what was available in the newspapers. And actually, some of our newspapers do a pretty good job of reporting on crime, particularly Newsday and the Herald. They have crime reporters there, and they report on a range of these things. We were looking in the newspapers to see whether these figures, whether these kinds of crimes were being reported in the newspaper and with what frequency. So the first thing we found was that what was very interesting, and we surveyed the newspapers every day, collated all the reports, analyzed all those reports, and then produced these in this particular table. Now, what you can see of those reports, what you can see is a very different pattern, completely differently. Now, this may not, and we say this quite clearly in the report, this is a function of the attention that newspapers and journalists are giving to particular crimes, and may not actually be the actual statistics that are collated by the police. But mind you, the police are also saying very publicly, and ministers are saying, the president is saying, we are concerned about armed robbery. But what you can see there is an enormous increase in robbery, in armed robbery and robberies. In fact, they reverse. You have a much lower reporting of robberies and a much higher increase in reporting on armed robbery. Firearms, not so high. Rape, very high. They do report rape. And rape, if we go back to previous table, rape was quite low. But rape, as they reported, seems to have increased. And murders have increased. And I want to make a comment about murders. Murders are a difficult thing to deconstruct, because some of the murders involve intentional murders. People in an armed robbery, you shoot someone, right? But there are also murders that take place where a person is unlawfully killed. And many of those are domestic disputes. And in reading those reports, it did strike me that a lot of those murders seem to be related to stress, the kind of stress that people were living in, that couples would get into terrible fights and somebody would be killed. I think the most poignant one was a woman who's in her 80s who got upset with her husband who was shouting at her, and she hit him with a brick and he died. Well, she hit him with a brick and therefore it's a murder, but she obviously was at the end of her tether. And there were a lot of those domestic murders. So when you say murder is increasing, it's not murder necessarily related to crimes, armed robberies, but it's also domestic and fights. And just out of interest, to try and get some comparison between what is really not good data, the stuff coming from the newspaper is not good data. What we then did was try to compare 2019 and 2020. Now, there's a little bit of a statistical game here, so bear with me. If you look at it, what you've got are the percentages of each of those crimes, and you've also got their rank, which was the frequent. Now, what you can see, and this is a way in which you can compare. We won't put our hands on our heart and say this is hardcore science, but it's indicative. What you can see is that in 2019, assault was number one, okay? And murder was number one in 2021. But armed robbery had gone from 6th to 2nd. Now, what this is saying is there are big changes taking place, and we would need the hard statistics to be able to deal with that. Now, one of the points was to, what's happening here? I'm not going down. Right, sorry. Now, if you go and look at it, one of the points here was, what do the crime statistics say about the involvement of security forces in it, in all of this stuff. Now, frankly, it's very difficult to do that because court reporting reports a whole lot of people being arrested, but they don't always tell you who that person is, okay? So that person may well turn out to be a policeman later on or soldier later on, and sometimes they tell you straight up. So you've got to track these things over time to find out what's happening. But for the cases in which it was clearly reported that security force personnel were involved in crime, you can see the pattern there, okay? Low murders, rapes, assaults, very high number of assaults, no reports of GBH, a lot of offenses involving firearms. And some of these offenses were people dealing in arms, buying and selling arms, which is quite serious. Armed robberies, they were 9% of it, and robberies, 16% involved in robberies, and 18% of them involved in other kinds of things. So the evidence quite clearly says that there is a pattern. Now, you can't put your hand on your heart and say that pattern is what's the extent of it, but you can say there is enough to get very, very worried about, just as the minister and the president have said, and this requires a deep investigation of what's going on. And in order to do that, we drew a series of conclusions. Okay, that crime and serious crime is increasing. Security force are involved, but the extent is not clear. It is impossible to draw links from this data that these are linked to transnational organized crime, although some of the reports suggest that people are doing naughty activities across the border, and the one report that comes from Mutare about all sorts of stuff moving backwards and forwards, and there are also reports from the southern border where these things are happening. An additional point that came out of this, and this was very seriously, we thought, and that was there were a whole series of cases in which people, including security force people, were arrested for armed robberies and very serious crimes, and they were granted bail. And in several of these cases, immediately were involved in crimes again, which is a very serious issue. And this issue of granting bail to people who are clearly perpetrators of very serious crimes must be looked at by the courts. And they must be looked at by the courts because one of the consequences of those things, in some of those crimes when they were released and other armed robberies took place, members of the Zimbabwe Republic Police were shot and wounded, and some of them died. So you're releasing people out there who have no compunction in violence. So this is very important. And there must be a much stronger effort at gun control. So we made a series of recommendations. The first is we need data. 2020, we needed to know from Zimstat what the statistics are. It's not enough to have generalized statements from the police to say a lot of people or 10,000 people arrested for this. We need those statistics provided so that we can analyze them and understand what the implications are for public safety and what the implications are for wider kind of criminal networks. The important second point is that there must be very frank disclosure of all crimes involving security personnel. When the minister says all these armed robberies involve members of the security force, this is frankly alarming, right? It means you say to the public, be very frightened of the police. They're the guards, they're looking after us. So don't make blanket statements if you don't have the data to back it up. If the police or the army or other people are involved in crime, we need to know what the extent is. It may well be a case of a very small number of personnel, and in fact is not a big problem. Okay, and finally the comment about bail.
I think something is happening there.
I saw. That's my final point. I've made my point. So the point is we need the statistics, We need frank disclosure, and we need to be seriously involved in the non-granting of bail to serious criminals. Thank you, Justina.
Thank you very much, Tony. I think with what we saw there, we might have been hacked. We might have trolls on the call. I'm not sure how we can deal with that, but we're going to proceed with our discussion. And thank you, Tony, for that presentation. Tony speaks about the features of fragility and also brings in a lot of statistics in terms of armed robberies. But maybe, Tony, I might want to find out if you guys were able to find out where these guns are coming from. Are they service rifles of the security personnel, or people are able to get guns from somewhere? Where are these guns coming from?
Well, if you look at the reports that were available, there were a number of cases in which people were involved in smuggling guns, smuggling in and out. So, you know, the region is rife with guns. You can buy guns. So they're smuggling and bringing them in. It also appeared that some of them were emerging from probably other armed robberies. You know, it's a classic pattern: rob a house, person's got a gun, then you've got a gun yourself. It's not very clear from all of this. But what it does mean, you know, for public safety, is there must be much stricter gun control and understanding. And one of those must be, in order to protect the police stations and the checking out of weapons and the bringing them back in and the register of weapons and stuff like that, there needs to be very high security on that. If you now got security force personnel involved in serious crimes, the provenance of those weapons becomes really critical. Are they coming out of state agencies, or are they coming out of criminal gangs? You'll note there was a report in South Africa where members of the South African police were taking guns that were confiscated and then selling them to members of the gangs. So gun control becomes extremely important in this thing. It's difficult to say that without the general statistics, but the crime statistics need to be compiled to find out exactly where in each of those cases, where did the guns come from? It's critical to find that out. Thanks, Justina.
Thank you very much, Tony. And we're going to move on to Godfrey Maringira, who is a professor of social anthropology at the Sol Plaatje University. Godfrey, are you in the house? Over to you. Godfrey?
Oh, thank you, Justina. Thank you very much, Tony. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to make a response to Tony's presentation with regards, not the whole of the document, because I think that I would leave to others, part of the panelists as well. But what I wanted to respond to is mainly the idea that is to do with the security sector involvement in crime and use of guns and the perpetuations of guns in the doing of crime itself. So what I would like to annotate is the idea of gun use that seems to be a trend from Tony's consolidated report. And what is quite fascinating is something that is not coming out strongly from the report, but it is there, but it's not coming out strongly, which has to do with why is it that security personnel, including the army, police, and other security organizations, state security organizations, continues to be involved in crime. And one of the issues has to do with the issue that we may call the militarized mind. And if one conceptualizes a militarized mind, what it does in a particular context, that can help to unravel particular issues that has to do with the perpetuation of crime by the security personnel themselves. It might be the military or the police as well. So what the military does is that it actually trains and legitimizes the use of violence or the use of crime, which is actually a Weberian idea in which the military itself is legitimized to use violence, and in some cases, the doing of crime is regarded as an individual initiative, which then sustains the state itself. So in this regard, what then happens in a context in which Tony is referred to his background as a way in which people themselves, particularly the military or the police, when they leave the barracks in a context of fragility, when they leave the barracks, what then happens is that they do not leave behind the legitimized crime. They do not leave behind the legitimized violence in the barracks. So the very fact that they leave the barracks, the very fact that they may leave their uniforms behind the barrack, does not entail that they have left behind the skill of doing that legitimized violence. And this is one of the problems when Tony was talking about the idea of trying to limit the use of guns, gun possession, use of guns, and access to guns. It is not all about accessing the gun as an object in this regard, but trying to demilitarize the skill that has been embedded in a particular soldier through an embodied experience in this regard. So how do we do that to demilitarize a militarized mind? A militarized mind in this case, which has been, in this regard, been embodied to do that justified violence, that legitimized violence. And this is a question which many of the countries, like even the US, the British, and even in South Africa, have failed to deal with that part of demilitarized a skill that can kill. So, in actual fact, what we often think is that that particular ideology can easily be taken away, the ideology of doing crime. Because oftentimes when soldiers are serving, when the police are serving, what they do is criminal, but that criminal is justified by the state. It is legitimized by the state itself. So how do we then take away that ideology, that subjective experience, that subjectivity of doing violence, that subjectivity of doing crime that is celebrated by state institutions at the time when they are serving? So there is actually a thin line between what is justified in the barracks and what is unjustified outside the barracks. And there's also actually a thin line between leaving the barracks and going into the civilian community. That pathway of leaving the barrack, that pathway of leaving a police camp, going into the civilian community, where the expectation of doing crime is no longer celebrated, becomes quite difficult. And that thin line is actually difficult to deal with in terms of intervention by NGOs and even the government itself in trying to demilitarize that soldier that is actually leaving the barracks to go into the civilian setting, where the codes and ethics are that of an innocuous human being. So the innocuous human being doesn't exist for a military personnel. The innocuous human being doesn't exist for a state security agent who is celebrated within the barrack. Because that celebration of doing violence, that celebration of doing crime is actually what sustains the state, because it is celebrated and it sustains the state in particular ways. So it makes the state survive. So when it makes the state survive, that skill is carried on to a civilian community where it is no longer celebrated. So how do we deal with this conundrum? So the conundrum that we are facing now is to try to take away that subjective experience of doing violence, which is celebrated by the state. So how do we do that? And that becomes quite a key problem when Tony was talking about the intervention in terms of gun use, gun possession, and gun violence, as well as doing crime by using violence. Because these are the legacies of the military. These are legacies of the police. These are the legacies of the state security. These legacies are celebrated legacies and are embodied and embedded into the mind. So that question, I think, is one of the questions which we can engage with. How do we then demilitarize a mind that is celebrated by the state? Thank you, Justina.
Thank you very much, Godfrey, for that input. And I'm intrigued by the militarized mind. And I think you specifically say it's a difficult thing to take up as government, even as NGOs, for us to be able to demilitarize this skill that is celebrated. But how do we then balance this act? Is it possible for this act to be balanced?
Thank you, Justina, for that question. I think the idea of balancing is a never-ending practice that we may think of, trying to balance. Because if we read sometimes, we'll find out that state security agencies or the state security institutions are greedy institutions. They are quite greedy to the extent that they do not want to share what they have, or they do not want to balance what they have. Why is it that state security institutions are so greedy to the extent that they want to maintain their survival as a state in this regard? So trying to balance that idea of an individual who does and survives and thrives on violence becomes problematic for the state. Because if you try to take away that militarized mind that celebrates violence and crime, that celebrates gun ownership and gun access and use, and to include killing itself, in this regard, the state will not allow that. Why the state doesn't allow that is because the state thrives on and is sustained by violence through individuals whom they train to do that violence. So oftentimes, it is often easier to become a state security agent or to become a soldier, to become a police. It's easier to become one, but it's very difficult to leave behind what you've learned and to survive and thrive on that violence and crime in a context of fragility, as Tony has put it rightly. So it's quite problematic, Christina, in this regard.
Thank you so much, Godfrey. And now we move on to Dewa Mavinga, my brother, who is the director of Human Rights Watch in Southern Africa. Dewa, over to you.
Thank you so much, my sister Justina. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dewa.
Okay.
We can hear you.
All right, thank you. So I really want to appreciate this report that Tony has presented on crimes by the security forces who will guard the guards. It's really a great piece of work, and in my view, a tip of the iceberg when you look at the situation in Zimbabwe. And I will, in some ways, agree with the comments made by Godfrey and say that, from where I sit, I want to look at the political context, of, let's start more recently, from the military coup of 2017. Now, you have a group of people with a political ideology that says, Chinu Chelu, this thing, Zimbabwe, this space is our space. And these are armed people who believe that they hold a position elevated above the law. So there is a sense of operating outside of the framework of the rule of law. And for the military, particularly if you look at the military within the security sector, there is a sense of an elevation or a rank which says the police are a much weaker force that cannot challenge, what happens with the military. So that contributes in a big way to this pattern that we now see of the security forces being increasingly involved in crime, in armed robberies, and they do that because they can, number one, but they also do that because they know or they believe that they can get away with it. So there is a sense of impunity that says, we have the power, we are in charge, we control the political spaces, and therefore there will be no accountability that will come to us. And this actually fuels and emboldens these actors. And when you then look at the police, there is a difference to the soldiers, to the military. Almost always there is a reluctance to investigate or to pursue. So it's not just about the capacity of the police to investigate, but it's an unwillingness, a standing aside, where the police would literally fold their hands behind their backs and say, we will not look into these things. And this environment then encourages those that commit abuses because they believe they are the law. That's what they believe. And so they commit all kinds of abuses. And at the level, again, at the political level, we see that the authorities are not taking the appropriate steps to have in place accountability mechanisms. And there is the complaints mechanism for members of the public to complain about the conduct of the security services. But that still is being delayed. There is no progress towards operationalizing it, although it was framed in the 2013 Constitution, Section 210. So that again shows that there is an idea that we should not talk about accountability. I have started in 2017, but this pattern has been on since 1980, since the Bukura massacres. If you look at how those crimes were committed, and I do agree with Godfrey that when people are contracted by the state to commit crime, serious human rights abuses, they can also then do the side jobs of their own crimes and abuses with the same weapons because they know that there is no accountability. And of course, they are suffering because of the economic conditions. They have nothing. Some of them think that this is actually a way to make money. We have seen this with reports about security forces involved in illegal mining, security forces involved in poaching, security forces involved in armed robberies in Zimbabwe and across the border in South Africa. And so it's because they have the weapons, they have the ammunition, and they can abuse at will because the mechanisms to hold them accountable do not exist, or they are just too weak, and there is no political leadership that says enough is enough. And of course, given the coup, the military coup, there is also a sense that the political leadership is deferring and is reluctant to decisively deal with crimes from the security forces because they owe their power, to these same people. So they don't want to rock the boat, and so they treat softly around issues that involve the security forces and try and pretend that those things will be resolved. So there is no transparency. So when these crimes are committed, and Tony did mention this, the problem of tracking and finding out, identifying those that commit the crimes, there is a brick wall that you reach as a researcher, as activist, because you will not be able to access what happens within the barracks in terms of the systems that are, whether they are there or they are not there. So And these are some of the things that we really need to look at to say, if something is to be done about these crimes, it's not just about, you know, tabulation and having a clearer picture, but it's also about political will. It's about the authorities saying there is no one who is above the law. About saying that everyone should be held accountable if they commit crimes. And of course, this should include crimes that relate to human rights abuses, like abductions, you know, like torture. So when you know, state agents abduct people in broad daylight, we have seen this with this is what happened in your case, my sister Justina, we have seen this with Itai Zamara. And these people are, Chatenda Mombearara and others, these people are armed and clearly working for the state. But there is no one who can trust them. The same with the case of Joanna Momombe, Cecilia Shimbire, and Nesaimaro. So accountability should be broad to include all crimes, including those that supposedly, you know, sort of prolong the state's, you know, the regime's hold on power, because those are some of the crimes that they want to say they are being committed in the name of the regime, and therefore should be ignored or should be forgiven. But if we don't address those crimes, it means that we will not have a path forward in terms of dealing with all these other crimes that we see. And the mechanisms are simply not there. Civilian arms that are there, the judiciary, and they are really afraid of the security forces. They cannot hold them accountable. So really, I think in short, the short answer to the question, who will guard the guards, is that at the moment, it seems in Zimbabwe that there is a fear from the authorities to ensure that there is someone to guard the guards. The complaints mechanism that was supposed to be there is not there, and therefore no one is empowered at law at the moment to guard the guards. And this is something that presumably the security forces will be enjoying. Thank you so much, Justina. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dewa. And as you were speaking there, I was just thinking that it's probably about 22 months to the elections. And what we have seen from 2020 is that we have seen security forces actually topping the list of perpetrators. What do you see happening, considering what Godfrey has said in terms of that these criminal acts and the violence is actually justified and celebrated in the barracks? And at the end of the day, they are not able to leave that mind in the barracks. What do we see happening as we head towards the 2023 elections?
Hello. Hello. So sorry, I was struggling to unmute. So can you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now I'm muted. Okay. Thank you. I am afraid that, you know, things might get worse, because, you know, this is not gratuitous violence. This is not just mindless crime. It is a validation and a source of power. You know, a source of political power, a source of economic power, and control. So as we approach the 2023 elections, if there is a significant threat to the political power base, we are definitely going to see an escalation in these crimes and in violence, because, you know, this kind of violence, these crimes are, you know, a political tool to maintain political authority in Zimbabwe. They are strategically deployed to ensure that those in power remain in power. So what needs to happen is that I think there needs to be, you know, higher levels of exposing these abuses, the connections, the networks, and including the economic and financial benefits and beneficiaries of this system, so that when we talk of pushing to expose, the leadership must be held accountable. That is the only way that we can remove, you know, the military from this place of violence. So we need to do much more to expose and to coordinate in ways and to push for accountability mechanisms, not just in Zimbabwe, not just in terms of the constitution, but beyond Zimbabwe. What could be the accountability mechanisms that are there? I know that in South Africa, the authorities there, including the special branch of the police, are investigating abuses that have taken place in Zimbabwe by the security forces, because there is also concern of a spillover and of these abuses and this violence and this crime into the region. So there is concern in Botswana, in Namibia, and especially in South Africa. So we need to look at mechanisms in those spaces as well that can be used. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dewa. And at this stage, we would want to give people the opportunity to ask the panelists questions, and you will indicate your intention to ask a question by raising your hand. And then I'll be able to identify you, and that way we will then be able to proceed. If anyone sees any hands, please alert me. I don't see any hands at the moment. Okay. Right. I recognize Simbarashe. Simbarashe, you can go ahead. Let's keep our questions brief as much as possible. Simbarashe.
Thank you, Justina, for the opportunity. No, my question is directed to Godfrey. I think he talks of the violence that is embedded in the soldiers, and I think it's made worse because of the crisis that the soldiers and other Zimbabweans are facing. What are the possibilities of demilitarizing that mind, especially with the ongoing crisis with regards to salaries and other things within the military sector? What are the prospects of demilitarizing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simbarashe. I will take a question from Rikim Konza and then Yasin, and then I will have the panelists respond to those three, and then we will take another round.
Thank you very much, Justina. Thank you to the presenters. I think they were quite insightful presentation. My name is Rikim Konza. I am a senior lecturer at Swan University of Technology in the Department of Public Management. My question is, I don't know who will take it, but my question is has to do with the historical context to this use of violence and use of guns. I think just to give context to my question, Justina, I think the Zimbabwean state was, or it's believed to have been created through the waging of the liberation struggle and the celebration of the use of guns. In fact, when we were growing up, I remember we used to listen to songs like Zimbabwe Yakauya Nehondo Akomana. You know, to what extent does that history, you know, influence, you know, the use of guns that we seem to see as being prevalent in Zimbabwe? So I wanted our presenters to look at this historical basis that I think has an influence in this problem that we're facing.
I was struggling to unmute. Thank you very much for that question. Maybe now I need to have responses from the technical people. It tells me we have 1 minute, 13 seconds left. What do? We still have questions coming up. Should we rejoin? What should we do?
Yes, we will rejoin.
Okay, so can I ask everyone to rejoin, please? And when we regroup, we will begin with Yasin. Thank you. I think Yasin is in the room at the moment. Yasin, can we hear from you before I give the panelists to respond? But I think I will also take a question from Wilbert. We had indicated you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you for that, Chair. I think my question for the panelists in general is, we're talking about holding our people accountable. And for me, the question is, what does that look like? When we say we want to hold those who should be guarding us accountable as, just an ordinary citizen, what does accountability look like? What does that mean on a practical level? Thank you.
Wilbert, are you back? Wilbert? If he is not back, then I will ask the panelists to respond to the questions that have been tabled.
I'm back. I was waiting to be unmuted, Justina. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Yeah, my question, whilst Tony addressed the issues, is open for any of the panelists to take, and possibly they can also assist in this question. My question relates to the issues which Tony raised, especially in terms of his recommendations. One of the worrying issues being the fact that these criminals are being granted bail. We notice that they go to court, they are granted bail, and they are released on bail. And Tony's recommendation is that there is need for a reconsideration of this. But the challenge that we have at the moment is that bail is a right which is prescribed in terms of the Constitution. And one of the things that we have been clamoring for is constitutionalism, respect for the Constitution, and this particular issue to say, if we really have to respect the Constitution, then we have this challenge that because bail is a right, ideally, and the Constitution says, any person who is brought before the court, he has a right to bail. How do we balance insofar as these issues are concerned? Because we always see them. We will recall the last time, I think we had the data breach criminals, with one of them said to have been on the run for the last 20 years, 19 years, 20 years or so. And suddenly he was granted bail. I think the only thing which kept him in custody was another pending case that was there, but he had been granted bail. So the question is, how do we balance on this particular issue so that we protect the citizens? And maybe the other issue is that we also seem to take note of the fact that the security forces, in police in particular, are taking advantage of these said criminals. We had a number of reports of people being gunned down, ostensibly because they were criminals, there was an exchange of gunfire, or that they were running away and they are shot by the police, and which looks more like elimination. How can we safeguard the right to life in circumstances such as those? Because even criminals have the right to life. Those would be my two questions.
Thank you very much.
Oh shit, sorry.
Thank you very much, Wilbert. I will ask Dewa to go first, then Godfrey, and then last will be Tony.
Hello. Thank you so much, Justina and Wilbert, for that question. I think more broadly and to the earlier questions by Yasin, I think what needs to happen is to have effective accountability mechanisms, and this includes the implementation of the constitutional section 210 complaints mechanism that receives complaints from the public and ensures that there are appropriate remedies in place. I think the problem is that the law is not working as it should. People are operating outside the framework of the rule of law. So we need to have a way in which there is strict adherence to the rule of law, where everyone is equal before the law, and the justice system confirms such, which means that the police must be empowered and there must be political will to do that, to ensure that they can have thorough investigations in accordance with the law and the constitution, and which would lead to successful prosecutions. If we deal with the issue of removing the politicization of the military or the security sector, and we ensure that the security sector is subjected to the rule of law and to law, including the CIO having a regulatory law that governs it properly, then perhaps we could have a significant chunk of these challenges resolved. And to answer Wilbert's question on the right to bail, yes, it should be guaranteed, but if there is transparency, if there is accountability, if there are mechanisms to decisively deal with the security forces and in matters of crime, then we may not perhaps need to consider the aspect of blanket denial of bail, because at the moment, the systems are not working, the laws are not working. And this has been the problem historically. My brother Ricky has raised this question about the historical aspects of these things. Impunity has been a running thread historically in terms of the crimes committed by the security forces. So if it becomes public and clear that the security forces are removed from politics and political interference and are subjected to the law, it will not really be about the militarized mind that is the issue. The issue is the lack of punishment and accountability. Because if people are subjected to the law, then they will have clear deterrent measures that will be applied to them. But at the moment, they are actually emboldened by the absence of any deterrent measure. It's a wild, wild west. They do as they please, and many times they get away with that. So those will be my interventions. Thank you.
Maybe now we can hear from Godfrey in terms of the questions that have been posed. Godfrey, over to you. Godfrey, I think your network is struggling there.
For the questions.
Sorry, Godfrey.
I'll respond to two questions. One of the questions which was asked by Simba on the prospects of demilitarizing in the context of crisis. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you.
Can you hear me now, Justina?
Yes, Godfrey, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
And sorry for the network. So I will respond to the two questions, one raised by Simba and the other one by another participant. So the one that has to do with the prospects of demilitarizing in the context of crisis in Zimbabwe. A response to that is that I will respond at least in two folds. One of the folds is that people have to understand that militarization of the military itself, or of military personnel, or of state security agencies is a resource. It is a resource. It is a political resource for the state to survive. And in a context like Zimbabwe, whereby the state is struggling to survive itself, it will not allow in any circumstances to demilitarize its personnel in this regard. So there are some prospects of demilitarizing, and there should be a lot of investment which should be resourced around the demilitarization of that particular subjective experience. Because it is one question to deal with people who are leaving the barracks, but also it's another question to deal with their subjective experience. So the subjective experience of what they've been taught to do is the problem. And dealing with that issue, which is always been celebrated by the state, and it's a source of recognition of military personnel and state security agencies of that militarization process. So to demilitarize it becomes problematic. It becomes problematic also in two ways. What are the ways? One of the ways is that, I will respond to this in questions. What does the crisis do to the barrack? And what does the barrack do to the crisis? And these are pertinent questions if we are to understand military personnel in the context of committing violence and crime. Because the objectification of a crisis to the barracks becomes a problem. And whereby the barrack is objectifying a crisis. So we have two objects which are in a conundrum in this case, a crisis and a barrack and a crisis. And what they do to each other in the objectification process becomes problematic, demilitarizing that mind. So it is never a never-ending process, and civil societies, NGOs should be able to engage these military personnel in order to deal with the subjective experience. So the second question, which one of the participants asked about the perpetuation of Zimbabwean day robber by guerrillas or by ex-combatants. In this regard, that perpetuation, people should also understand that after 1980, a bit of history, and I understand all of us will understand this history, whereby guerrillas or ex-combatants now have been allowed to serve in the Zimbabwe National Army. So what is it that they are doing is not only to save the state, but to save their self as individuals within the barracks in a context of the military itself. So what they teach and how they carry that guerrilla mentality in the so-called professional Zimbabwe National Army in post-1980 independence becomes a problem. It becomes a problem in the sense that the guerrilla mentality continued to exist in the so-called professional army in post-1980. And what is it doing, this mentality, in an already militarized profession? So these are some of the issues that we need to really problematize. And I would like these issues to be debated, but also at a practical level in terms of intervention. People have to sit down to think it through. What is it that is needed to undo a subjective experience that has been embedded with the gun mentality? So I think those are some of the issues in which we can engage. It's an open debate, and we have different issues to say. Thank you, Justina.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you, Dewa, and thank you, Godfrey, and thank you for the questions. I'd like to unpack this and answer the questions in the same way. The report says we have concerns that security force personnel are becoming involved in crime. If you read the report, you will see that it's serious crime that we're worried about, violent crime, armed robberies, and those kinds of things, but a range of other kinds of activities. Now that's just an event, or are there a series of crimes, but they have to be linked and they have to be seen in the context. So what the report tries to do is to link these kinds of crimes with the notion of a state that is fragile. And I encourage people to look at what the notion of fragility means, because what fragility really talks about is how the state is losing control of the country. And I think that if you look carefully at all the indicators of this, you would see a country in which the state is losing control. These are the conditions that eventually lead from fragility to failed. But in the context of that process, what then begins to happen is opportunities for crime begin to happen at all sorts of levels. And that's why we raised the issue of transnational organized crime and the notion of illicit financial flows, and obliquely to the reports that have come out about serious cartels and the way in which money is being moved out of the country. But then it drops to lower levels in which other levels of the state become involved in criminal activity. And now we're starting to talk about the guards who are becoming involved in this. And this is all in the context of a fragile state, of a very, very damaged economy, livelihoods that are not livelihoods anymore for any people. And so the opportunities for crime and self-financing become very important. So when you begin to look at the holistic picture, it is critical that some kind of serious control begins to happen in the situation. Now, some of that is exactly what Dewa is talking about. There needs to be a major political shift in which the state is able to control its coercive power, but not only that, to provide the population with legitimate livelihoods where they're not reliant on crime, and where perhaps members of the security forces don't feel that they have to self-finance and don't get linked to other kind of criminal groups within and without the country and within and without the state. So this is the big problem that we actually face. The question then that I think Wilbert raised, and so did Dewa, is the absolute adherence to constitutionalism. And I couldn't agree with them more. But there must be a process in which the constitutional right to bail is balanced against the crime. I mean, I find it incredible that a man who is arrested for an armed robbery is granted bail and 3 days later is shot dead in another armed robbery by the police. And, you know, we can be very down on the police and everyone else, but the police themselves also deserve a measure of safety from armed criminals and do not have to feel at threat by armed criminals all over the place. And you look at the South African statistics and the number of policemen who die in armed robberies and things, it is clear that we are in a major chaotic situation. And that chaotic situation is described by fragility. And the fragility requires political solution of a major kind. And then we can address the kinds of problems of the militarized mind and getting the police to have a more civilian policing mentality, not have the army involved in civilian affairs, and proper investigative procedures. But we must see this thing as holistic. Armed robberies, in the view of this report, and it is very partial evidence, and it certainly requires much, much, much more detailed analysis and available statistics in order for us to understand what kind of threat there is to the citizens from the guards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, Dewa, and Godfrey, for those really compelling discussions that we have had on this matter. And also looking at my clock, we just have a few minutes left before we end this dialogue. I think on behalf of the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, I would like to thank all the participants as well. And at this stage, I think I would want to then launch the report and also thank SAPES Trust for allowing us to do this on this platform. I think the report is going to be shared just now. There is a link that has also been shared in the chat. Fortune, please put the cover on. Fortune? We might be facing a bit of a glitch technically. We had hoped that you would be able to see the cover of the report. Are we able to do that, Fortune?
Yes, Chair. I'm just working with the technical so that I'm able to share my screen.
Okay. If I can ask for your patience as the technical people are sorting it out. Yes, there you are, the report that we have been discussing, and I think it is now officially launched. Who guards the guards? Monitoring crime and security forces' involvement in crime. And those who have been involved in the production of this report, the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, Heal Zimbabwe Trust, members of the forum being the Research and Advocacy Unit, and also the Counseling Services Unit. So now I just want to thank everyone for being part of this policy dialogue. Thank you for coming around. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you very much, Justina, for the usual good performance. And
thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for the brilliant presentation as usual. And I'm sure we will relish the report, and we will hopefully follow up the report. But thanks very much to the panelists, and thank you for choosing SAPES Policy Dialogue as a forum. Look forward to the next occasion. Thanks, Justina.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Kaina komi moto ona bango